Hello, everyone. Welcome to AME's Digital Culture Speaker Series. My name is Bob Beard, excuse me, and I'm a program manager at the Center for Science and the Imagination. Thank you so much for being a part of these and sharing your time and your imaginations with us, especially as we continue to contend with the very strange state of the world and a media landscape that is becoming increasingly science fictional just day by day. It's perhaps a grievous understatement to say that the entertainment industry has incredible influence and impact on how we perceive the world and also how we choose to move through it. So it's really refreshing to meet someone like today's guest, a media producer and executive who uses their powers for good, not only by democratizing the tools of the trade, but also by anticipating and building new ways to use the media to bring forth better futures for all of us. John Heinsen is a veteran of Fox, ABC, and ICM. I believe he was the first transmedia producer for the Academy Awards, and now he focuses on the development of a range of TV, film, and emerging media projects all around the world via his company Bunnygraph, which is based in Los Angeles. His digital clients include WatchMojo.com, Shareable.net, and the GSMA Mobile World Congress Americas. In 2019, Bunnygraph launched a series development deal with Handmaids Studios in Zagreb, Croatia, with the aim of creating animated series with global and social impact. John serves as on the executive committee for the Producers Peer of the Television Academy and is the former vice president of new media for the Producers Guild of America. He sits on the influencer advisory board for the culture trends think tank Sparks and Honey. He's a mentor for the Storytech Startup Accelerator in Tallinn, Estonia. He's a graduate of the American Film Institute Conservatory and that other school to the south. If you would, please welcome John Heinsen.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you very much. Thank you, Bob, for that introduction. It's really great to be here. I'm very happy, as always, to lecture at ASU, although I definitely have some ties to Tucson, but that's okay. I've actually, a lot of the faculty over the years from U of A that I know have ended up in Tempe, and so I do spend a lot of quality time there. So I want to thank you all for having me here today to share with you some of the work that I'm doing right now in the social impact space around the UN Sustainable Goals. So if it's okay with you, we're going to talk, I'm going to share my screen now, and I will open up the chat, and we will go. Okie doke, here we go. Okie doke. So catching the long tail of sustainability entertainment. So as Bob mentioned, I have an experience at television networks, studios, digital, traditional, and all the rest. And so now in this evolving world that we're in, they talk about the long tail, right? The long tail of our business, which is all about, not about the money and exposure you can get up front, but really this lengthy and ongoing ecosystem of content consumption and monetization. So to begin, I want to begin with the idea that we are all storytellers. And let's see, is it going to be, here we go. We are all storytellers, right? Even from the beginning of time, it is within our nature as a people that we share stories. We share a story amongst ourselves. This is where we have our identity, our culture, our folklore, all those wonderful things. And of course, having attended university in Arizona, I know that there's this great richness of tradition among Native peoples about telling stories from the young and the old and all of the rest. And this is how their culture and tradition have endured. And very often it's generational. In fact, one of the things I've been most distressed about COVID is how it's affected the elders in many of the Native communities, which now has destroyed this traditional system of sharing stories down because these people are suddenly passing away from COVID. So in addition to the natural stories, we also have some of the other things that in Native peoples that they use to help tell their stories. Here's a storyteller doll. I'm sure you've seen those before. Obviously, totem poles tell a story. And then other forms of performance like dance and things like that as well tell a story. They inform us and they allow us to share, okay? And now this is an idea of how now as technology expands. So I don't know if you've ever seen one of these before, and I'm going to stop sharing for a quick second. If you've ever seen one of these before, this is a stereo view card. So this stereo view card, which you'll see in an antique store, is actually a global new media business from the year 1900. So in 1900, this was a billion-dollar global new media business. On the back, it is printed in multiple languages. It has a dual image that when put into a viewer creates a 3D image, something unlike anybody had ever seen. And so what you would do is you'd have a series of cards that you would put into the viewer that would tell a story. And this is how a lot of people knew the world at the time. Going back to this image here, I'm going to share again. This is a group of most likely very wealthy Japanese looking at the stereo view cards in the 1890s. Well, now this imagine of switching card out, card out, card out. This is actually what helped give Thomas Edison the idea of the moving image. So this is really at our beginning. So if you imagine this is 1900 and look at TV at 1950 and look at your phone today, technology and storytelling can go anywhere in the next 50 years. So it's a very exciting thing. Okay, so all right, here we go. Let's see. Okay, so now that we have all this technology, we're empowered to do a great deal with our stories, right? The stories allow us to take those stories and to share them, consume them, monetize them, all these other things, okay? And so when you talk about social impact, oh, and then again for the storytellers, now this I always show because this was like everything that I needed in, when I was in film school at AFI in 1994 to tell my stories, right? This is what I needed to reach an audience. Whereas today, it's this, right? So 20 years later, 20 years later, this is all you need. And so this now makes it much, much easier for us to tell our stories and to have meaningful impact. And the mobile device is the key. This is like the view box that sends us through to what we're seeing and consuming. And now on top of that, now once you have the content, you have this rich dynamic of social media. And of course, through the last 2 political elections, we've learned that social media can be very impactful in terms of the content we are consuming, right? This is really the future. But now, and then because of those stories, you're able to create communities. And with those communities, you create different subgroups, and different subgroups have different interests. And this is very important, related to the idea that these little subgroups is where our content is going to live. The idea of narrowcasting, micro communities, and things like that, okay? And that's certainly happening in television with the idea of all the different channels that we have. When I was an undergraduate, they talked about this vision of 500 channels in the 21st century. And now 30 years later, that's no big deal at all, right? Okay, so this idea and this concept in terms of sustainability really relate to this idea of creating content that sparks a conversation, builds community. And when you have community, you can entertain, engage, and influence. Now, this is something that Hollywood has kind of had a bit of a problem with because of this idea that they produce content. They are the factory, they are the machine. And that really what they do is they take that content and they put it on screens, or they broadcast it on a channel, and the audience is there. The audience consumes it, right? And so when they consume it, that level of engagement may become measured by ratings or box office. Sometimes they will do surveys to get a sense of what's going on with a show or a movie. They'll do focus groups, but these really aren't, in terms of really understanding. And then in terms of the impact, very often, if your message is one of impact and change, well, that often would come by accident, not necessarily by necessity. And so this new dynamic digital space that we're talking about is the idea of engaging audiences in this way: content, conversation, community. So now here's a great example of where Hollywood just kind of all of a sudden didn't even know what was happening. To Kill a Mockingbird, a film from the 1960s, book from the 1930s by Harper Lee. Very successful book, all about racial injustice in the South. And the studio really decided to get behind this film and to make this film with Gregory Peck. And people were familiar with the book, but the film really was able to show on a much deeper level the idea of the racial injustice out there, because the media, traditional TV media and print media, weren't necessarily capturing that. And so this was something that really opened a lot of people's eyes. And this, early 1960s, during the Kennedy administration, basically leads us into the whole Martin Luther King movement and all of the rest because of this awareness of the film, okay? Now, since then, we've had other films, other great films, scores of great films that have tackled tough issues. If you've never seen The China Syndrome, that's all about safety and nuclear power. Dead Man Walking, is all about death row and the whole idea about death row reform and the idea of understanding, the death penalty and things like that. These were films that when they came out, they told a dynamic story, sometimes based in fact, sometimes based in fiction, and there'd be press around it. And the press would basically talk about these things. Sometimes maybe they'd interview the real people that are in the film. Maybe there'd be featurette content. A lot of that came later with DVDs. But this idea of these films that were out there about these hard things, they really didn't necessarily have the connective tissue to implement real change. They brought awareness to issues, but again, they really didn't empower the audience, okay? Other diamonds like Blood Diamond, talking all about things going on in Africa, the whole diamond industry. Films like Concussion. Now, I would argue that Concussion is another more recent film that was able to dig in and bring a lot of attention to this issue. And obviously, there's a lot of parents today that won't let their kids play football. And this film, the visibility and whatnot, really brought this out there. But I would argue a film like Concussion ended up not being a big film. And even Will Smith, he didn't get a Oscar nomination for this. A lot of people thought he should have, and he didn't. So this is part of the issue too, is they're making these films about social issues, but are the films really getting the audiences? Now in 2010, I believe it was, 2011, Ted Turner, who created CNN and things like that, Ted Turner donated $1 billion to the United Nations to help them tell their story. And what they decided to do was that instead of just infusing that money into the United Nations, they created the United Nations Foundation. And so the United Nations Foundation has been an organization that for 12 years has been out there trying to engage Hollywood so that you can tell authentic stories, right? So if you imagine a film like Hotel Rwanda with Don Cheadle, that was a film had no UN support or advisement on. Whereas now, as a producer, if I was doing a film about the genocide in Rwanda, the UN Foundation might provide me with experts so that I tell an authentic story. And so that's something very interesting that the UN has done and trying to make these inroads for impact. Now, very recently, we had this film, Dark Waters. This was I believe, an Amazon film. Mark Ruffalo, Anne Hathaway, Tim Robbins, these are Bill Pullman, all about, telling the story about the cover-up, about chemicals in the air and the water and all the rest. Now, this is a true story. It was a very, very good film with a very, very good cast. A lot of people did not go see this movie because you can tell right away what the subject matter is. And a lot of people just didn't want to see it. And a lot of people, I feel, it's kind of hard. A great actor like Mark Ruffalo, who's also a very dynamic activist, as is Anne Hathaway, Tim Robbins, and Bill Pullman, they know that this is going to be the kind of film that's going to go really deep in a story. And so that is why they were very much, this film, although it tried, to bring awareness, it really, really, really didn't get in front of enough eyeballs, okay, to make impactful change. And of course, in television. Now, in television, obviously, Handmaid's Tale is a great example of how, based on a book from 1985, all of a sudden came around to becoming very timely. This idea of this all too real future dystopian reality that, some people think could actually happen. And so again, this idea of, does this show make change? Does it say, oh no, we can't end up like that? And so this is another great example of how timing really does make a difference. There was a TV movie version of Handmaid's Tale with, let me see here, Robert Duvall, that very few people have seen. It's exactly like Handmaid's Tale, but the timing was wrong, that it just wasn't able to grab an audience. Okay, all right. So now documentaries. And so documentaries, if you go back to like the Inconvenient Truth or anything like that, those are films that Inconvenient Truth, brought a lot of attention to global warming. Al Gore won an Oscar for it and all the rest. But, in terms of what they were able to do, those issues from that film that's over 10 years old are still very much with us today. Now, this documentary, which premiered in 2020, Kiss the Ground by the Tickels, Rebecca and Josh Tickell, excuse me. They were teaching all about this idea of doing this documentary about how you heal the environment, beginning with the soil. And so it's all about soil rejuvenation. And so they make the documentary, it plays on Netflix, which is great, all of the rest. But now when you go to their website has this really dynamic interface that is all about resources for teachers to use it in school, longer versions and more deeper dive versions of the documentary for farmers to watch so that they can implement these practices. There are versions for college students in agriculture departments to learn about these kinds of things. And so it's very, very interesting. This is a group that is obviously very important about social impact, social change, and they realize that the film is only the beginning of the long tail. Okay. Okay. I haven't had the chat open. If anybody has questions in the chat, feel free to put them in. Okay. All righty. So now COVID hits, right? So COVID hits and it takes our entire society on this big tailspin. It takes us in a big tailspin in terms of our lives. Obviously, a great many people were affected health-wise, which is very tragic. It affected our work, our kids, everything top to bottom. And we're at home. And a lot of times now we're in this new dynamic of consuming huge amounts of content. So does this provide an opportunity for storytellers? Well, here we go. So this whole idea about content, really spiking since COVID, and this is actually just from in 2020, it's spiked a great deal since then, but this idea that audience is there and focused, right? And with this focus, of course, there was no content. There was no content to really help people, in terms of what was happening. And so now the whole zeitgeist took over. It affected everything from film to music and even to children. And so children in particular is what I wanted to talk about today. And in talking about this, I wanted to come and introduce you to this concept. So I don't know if you've ever seen this before. This is the concept of the Internet Minute. This is showing the space that storytellers tell their stories. In every 60 seconds, all of these things are happening. And this number is always changing and obviously growing. 500 hours of content is uploaded to YouTube every 60 seconds, just like this talk is being uploaded to YouTube. Everything from 700,000 stories shared on Instagram to people tweeting to, Netflix, new subscribers watching, all of this stuff. What's happening is, when I was in an undergrad in 1994, we had 6 channels. Cable was there, but we were not even at a point yet where cable was spending $1 million an episode, which didn't happen until 1996 with The Sopranos and Sex and the City. So now where we're at is this dynamic where people are creating content, consuming content, sharing content, commenting about content, all of these things that create this ecosystem. And this ecosystem is spinning with all this content being thrown into it, but there is very little life, very little heartbeat to it. because as people are commenting and sharing, that often is the end of it. The communities kind of form as they form. One particular thing I want to share, I remember, is the film Julie and Julia, if you remember that, all about Julia Child. And when that film came out, the studio decided that they would create a Facebook page for the movie. Well, what happened with that Facebook page is that platform at that time for that demographic and the demographic of the film, everything pointed in the right direction. And what happened with that Facebook page is that everybody started talking and sharing about the Julia Child recipes that they were making at home. And they were using this Facebook page as a conduit for this. So this is really, really interesting because you create the framework and then all of a sudden everybody digs in. So again, if they could do that for every film, the studios would love it and Facebook would love it, but it's just by chance. Most film pages for Facebook are pretty dead, especially once the film comes out. Okay, I'm going to share again. Here we go. Okie doke. Okay, so the Internet Minute, very important. So now I want to talk about this idea of transmedia. So I'm sure you've all heard the term before. Some people love it, some people hate it. I came into the transmedia space because when I was at Fox in the late 1990s, early 2000s, I was responsible for helping launch these new TV shows. I was a program executive. And what was very frustrating to us was that these shows would not get enough promotion time to build an audience. And so because of the financial pressures against the show, they would get canceled after 2-3 episodes, okay? Well, at that time in the late 90s, Fox was making deals with Yahoo and people like that. And I was seeing the kind of content that was being created, even though it was in its infancy. This is pre-YouTube and all the rest. But I saw that the internet's always on. And so I knew that the internet could be the potential as a promotional platform for broadcast TV shows to offset, the lack of inventory of promotion that was available to them on their traditional outlets. And of course, if you're going for a younger demographic like Fox was, the internet was where the kids were, right? So now, when I left Fox in 2003, it became this whole idea of, is the internet a viable space? Well, for me, the issue was, the internet, because it was always on, it never had this focus of eyeballs. And the focus of eyeballs is how you monetize television. And so I knew at that time the mobile space was going to evolve into something because of their business models that could become more viable. And so I got into mobile video very early. Mobile video went away in 2008, and that is when transmedia was born. And so the Producers Guild, and that was about the time I was recruited in the Producers Guild to be the founding co-chair of the mobile committee. Jeff Gomez, a very famous transmedia producer, helped the Producers Guild define what a transmedia narrative was. And so now going back to this is what we're talking about. So this idea of you would have a central intellectual property, the characters and the world they live in. You would have obviously this very dynamic platform range of platforms available to you. And then once you identified your audience, you would use your IP to tell independent stories to those platforms. So multi-platform is actually where it's on multiple platforms at once. Transmedia is where different stories are being told independently from these different platforms. Okay. And so transmedia is also very interesting because of this idea of how, because you're utilizing these other platforms, it's this idea of now technology is a big thing. So really for me, this idea of transmedia is this new medium of content convergence, which is really a combination of a merging of traditional media, branded advertising, and technology. Because as this content now is being consumed, everybody hates pre-roll, everybody hates ads. And so the ads, the brand integration is literally, taking us back to, Lucy and the cigarettes, right? All the wrappers on the package, and audiences really don't care for it. So that user experience, whether it's subscription or whatnot, the real future, I feel, is going to be brand integration, okay? And then this idea of technology, right? Because if you want to have cutting edge content, you want to have cutting edge technology, and technology is always the last mile. If you're creating content, Technology is going to be the last piece, because since there's no standardization in the marketplace, if I'm selling a TV show with digital extensions to CBS, that digital footprint might be different than ABC because of where they're at currently, where they're investing their time and their energy, their technology. So in this transmedia world where sustainability really can be championed, it's very important to know your audience, deliver on what you promise, and tell good stories. Because in this space, what fuels it all is social media. Now, in a story world, it's not just, and this is how film and TV is different. Before I was talking about how they would make a movie, they would make Dark Waters, and they would send it out, and they would get the ratings, right? And that's how they would know. And they would just get the film out there, and they would have press. Well, really, now when you look at this, the idea of creating content that's going to live, original content, that's going to be different types of content phased at different times. So you might have certain type of content in advance of your film, maybe even when you're making the film. You know, you think about this latest James Bond movie, all the time it took to produce this film because of COVID, they could have been creating all sorts of content, not just sneak peeks and all the rest, but all sort of cool ancillary content. Then when the film's in theaters, they could have different content that could be unlocked, and then obviously everything afterwards. So this is what a story world is all about, the world that your characters and whatnot live, powered by content and transmedia. Now, the notion of transmedia actually is not that new. It's actually, Star Wars is the great example of where George Lucas was able to take this world he created and leverage it in so many directions. You know, what's amazing about Star Wars is the box office is about $4 trillion, but the toys are 12 trillion, you know, out of the 27 trillion. Books and video games, everything else, licensing, television and merchandise. See what I mean? And so going back now to transmedia and having independent stories across independent platforms, as an example, I may not let my 10-year-old son watch Star Wars Episode 3 because I think it's too violent. But I might let him engage the IP through comic books, toys, and games. And so this, again, is this way that they're able to latch into audiences. The other interesting thing that George Lucas did was, let's see, we'll see, I have it here, going back to Star Wars. Oh, no, wrong direction. Okay, hang on, sorry. Okay, sorry. Okay, going back to Star Wars, you know, it's really interesting about the story world lasting for so many years. And this was certainly the case about 10 years ago when the new episodes were coming out. I think it's softened quite a bit since Disney took over. But it's this idea of now when I go to the store for Christmas and I'm going to buy my son the Lego Millennium Falcon, well, I'm just excited to get it as he is because I'm invested in the IP, right? So again, this idea of how can IP be multi-generational? Star Wars was lightning in a bottle in that regard. And now where we go is that the studios are all about these franchises, right? This idea of like Marvel superheroes. Now, for a lot of us, we engage these characters through previous iterations, whether it's Spider-Man, Batman, or all the rest, obviously starting with the legacy of comic books. But now what they do is they have the films, you know, and they talk about the idea about the streaming differentiator. So this is really looking at all the platforms here and where their sweet spot is for age and demographic. And so you'll see, and now HBO Max is not on here. This is actually a very new player in the space because Marvel falls into them. But this idea of different demographics become real audiences for studios, and they do not ignore it. They are not going to trust that because you want to go to the Spider-Man movie, you're going to take your little kid. And a lot of times now, you know, going back to these movies, Deadpool is very violent. You know what I mean? I love it, and my crazy kids love it. But, you know, a 5-year-old, you wouldn't take a 5-year-old to that. And so with a lot of these movies, now with these characters, you really don't know how edgy these films are going to be. And this, so in terms of what you're able to do with your audience, okay, this is something really important. So what are the studios doing? Well, they're doing this. They're creating different iterations of the IP for those different audiences so that the kids at a young age can engage this IP and then they can grow into it, okay? Now, talking about brands, and I don't know if you've ever seen this, this is the global brand map. And so this is an example of where all these brands live in the spectrum of things. And as you'll see, most of these brands are all owned by these handful of companies. And what you'll see here is they've got these different boxed off subsets. These are all the different groups. And so what happens is the creative teams that manage these groups are all very different. So an agency of record for one might be a different than another. You might have a digital agency for one brand and not another. So when you're trying to develop projects and you want to integrate brands, understanding this brand map and how the agencies work is really, really important, because now you can look for those logical partners that could potentially monetize, offset the cost of your content, which is very, very important. Now, this is interesting. This is Chiquita Banana, and they want to engage children. So what's the best way to engage children is go to them. And so now they're putting the Snapchat right on the banana sticker, right where the kids are at eating their breakfast. There's my kid reading his book, and there he is with the banana and the thing, okay? Now, of course, what I want to talk about is children today. This is relating to my work with the MaNaBu Foundation. The argument that I want to make to you guys is that where, the studios have been going to younger demographics and things like that, really, what are they learning from young Marvel characters? Okay, well, they're learning to like them. They're learning about good and bad. Very often it's good and bad, right? Star Wars, it's teaching us good and bad, light and dark side, right? Now, when you think about something like Sesame Street, which was a new show when I was a kid, Electric Company, Mr. Rogers, all these wonderful things, they were really developed around teams that were very concerned, and this is all on public television, about this idea of really impacting children's lives. But at the same time, they understood you had to entertain before you can educate. So that's what created this dynamic world of characters, Jim Henson and all the rest. But the team that developed Sesame Street is very interesting because they had educators, they had pediatricians, they had parents, they had ministers, they had psychologists, all these different people, athletes, all these different people coming together to understand what children need so that they could influence them. It was about their emotional well-being and that understanding. They were building emotional people. And this is how, when you talk about sustainability and making a better world, what we need to do in our mainstream programming, okay? And sharing again. So now with Sesame Street, it's really interesting because a lot of the revelations, and if you haven't watched Sesame Street lately, believe it or not, there is a Sesame Street Muppet, and I don't see it here, that is autistic. There is a Sesame Street Muppet that has HIV. There is, Bert and Ernie. A long time that's been the idea that they were created to create sensitivity and emotional empathy towards gay people. Oscar the Grouch was about creating empathy for homeless people. Really, really interesting stuff. And then this idea of emotional, like I'd said, Cookie Monster and Grover, these monsters that aren't the scary monsters under the bed. They love cookies and they're just like us, right? So this is what Sesame Street did, okay? All right. So now the big wave of content. The big wave of content that's coming out of COVID, coming out of everything, all this content we're creating, the traditional studios, I feel, are very antiquated in their thinking. They are thinking about, we're going to create this wave of content and the kids are going to love it. But what they don't realize is that kids today are not about this kind of wave. They are about this kind of wave. And kids want to be in it. I don't care how young they are. They want to be in the action. They want to be a part of it. This is what's so interesting about content today. This is why, TikTok and all these other ones allow kids to be the star, basically, right? Because they're creating the content. They're a part of the action. They don't want to see somebody else. They are building their self-esteem by doing this, right? And this is how they've organically through these platforms. Now, these platforms aren't curated. They're not moderated. They're not maintained. They're not monitored. And a lot of these kids are manipulated, and obviously cyberbullying and all these other things. But this idea of them being in the action is very, very, very real. So now, again, going back to this idea about, good guys and bad guys and all the rest, this is what Hollywood thinks of heroes for kids. These are the heroes that Hollywood wants my kids to embrace. But what they don't realize is that these are not the heroes of our children. This is the hero of our children. This is the hero. She is the one who is scared, angry, pissed, and motivated to make change. She is the one that is using her brain, seeing the world around her, seeing the stress of the adults around her, realizing I'm not safe, I've got to take action. And this is it. And what does it become? Kids relate. It becomes a movement. It becomes a movement with these kids. And it's really something amazing. And it is really educating us in the storytelling space, because this is a story. And it's not about making a TV movie about Greta. It's about what is she doing? This is change. These are seminal moments. If you think about the Parkland shooting, and I'm familiar with school shootings, Columbine, and even going back, there were some school shootings when I was in school and all the rest. But now these Parkland kids in Florida, they were up at the podium the next day. They were like, this is bullshit. Why is this stuff happening? Why are our friends dying? We need to have a voice, and we are going to use the media to call it out, because we want change in gun violence, right? It's not about just security. It's about, we got to get rid of these guns. And so this is this idea of real change. They believe, young people, they believe their peers. And this is what's really exciting for the future. Now, E.T. again is another great example of this idea of Steven Spielberg instilling empathy in children. This film came out when I was 11 years old, and I would argue that this film had a great impact on me in terms of my empathy. It's not my empathy for aliens, it's my empathy for people that are different than me. And the idea of don't judge someone by their cover, give someone the benefit of the doubt, and get to know them. And I feel these are the kinds of films for adults that parents can take their kids to, and they can implement real change. But now, in addition to that, there's also this idea of, can we go after the kids directly? Because as I said, they are involved. And how young can you go? Well, now I want to introduce you to these characters. So this comes from the MaNaBu Foundation. The word MaNaBu means learning, to learn in Japanese. And so we have this world we've created, the MaNaBu Foundation, and I'm a producer on this project. And so we have three characters here, main characters. The red character is Ma. He is the lovable one. He's got the emotion and the tree hugger and all that great stuff. The yellow one with the glasses is Na. So it's Ma and Na. Na is the one that's the intellectual. He's the one that questions things. He's the one that wants to understand why things are the way they are. And he's inquisitive and interested. And then you have Boo, the blue character. Now, Boo is the kind of character that he just kind of follows his instincts, follows his heart. He makes a lot of goofy mistakes. He's a kid. These characters we created are gender neutral. We felt that was very important. And, obviously this texture we give them is something new and different. And here are some secondary characters off to the left. So with Ma, Na, and Boo, we're developing a animated series that is going to teach children about the UN Sustainable Goals. And so I'm going to give you an example of how it works. So when kids are young, and our demographic for this is 3 to 8 is really kind of the demographic of the show. It could be as young as 3. And so what you're seeing here is a still image. Now, I remember when my kids were younger, we would have the picture books of animals and such. This was very common. And we would see these kinds of images. So this is how our show starts. We see an image of the world, of a world that we're going to be entering, and our characters enter that world through bubbles, because we know that children love bubbles. It allows them to go anywhere and any place. And so what happens is the episode starts with the bubbles. We float into frame, and when the bubbles come down and pop, it becomes an animated world. So everything we see in the image becomes animated, okay? But it starts with that still image. It takes us into the world and then pulls us, and then shows us the world and then pulls us into the animated world. It is exactly the same vehicle that Fred Rogers used with his trolley to make believe. It's the same kind of thing, which obviously was very successful. You had a musical cue and a physical cue that took you into his imaginary world. So that's what it's like. And so this allows our characters to go anywhere around the world. And what's interesting is that by showing kids these issues around the world, it's not about being a heavy message. It's about showing them, teaching them empathy. This is Brazil, the deforestation. This idea of they can see that this is wrong, right? And so what happens in an episode is that MaNaBu enter the world, and what happens is they will keep doing this, hang on, sorry. They will enter this world and they will interact with the children, usually children. They don't speak to adults. They only speak to children. And what happens is they come into this world and they get acclimated to the world. And sometimes they're embraced by their surroundings and sometimes they're not. And then they see something that's going on. So imagine this image here of the African kids in the village. The world becomes animated. And then imagine they go with the kids down to the river to play, and there's garbage in the river, or the river is not clean to drink, or whatever it's going to be. And so now Mana and Boo kind of go, oh, well, there could be a way to fix this, or how do we do this? And this isn't right. And then they teach the kids how to clean things up, okay? How to clean things up and how to inspire others and share that idea. And so this is to teach kids this idea of other parts of the world, people that live different than them, and then this idea of how you need to make change. So the idea would be that kids would be inspired to pick up garbage wherever they're at the beach or somewhere else, okay? And so this idea of empathy, right? Another great thing is that our characters, Mana and Boo, can speak to the animals. They may not know that they can speak to a polar bear, but when they get there, they can. And so this becomes, again, this opportunity to bring children into these worlds and to learn about things going on in the world, because the traditional media isn't necessarily showing this to kids. They might be afraid of it. But in an animated setting, they can see what's going on. So in this episode, imagine Mana and Boo help a cub get back to its mother. It's things like that, right? Now what happens is, at the end of every episode, it's not just a matter of, they can't, not in every instance, they're not gonna be able to change the world. But what happens is they are able to, celebrate that they've tried. And when they celebrate, when they have their Ewok moment, what happens is Boo, if you remember Boo with his smokestack, starts generating bubbles. That's what happens when he gets excited. And as the bubbles form, the kids play in the bubbles, and Mana and Boo float away to their next location. They leave without ever being thanked, just like the Lone Ranger. And so that's where we get that from. Now, of course, we've introduced a lot of exotic settings in MaNaBu, but there's also very familiar settings. And so this is what the show would do. It would take kids and teach them all about sustainability around the world, okay? Now, the show is just the show. I mentioned this before with all the rest. It's this idea of content, conversation, community. And so what the MaNaBu Foundation wants to do is to create movements, which is essentially like call to action campaigns around the themes of episodes. And these will all be taken through the MaNaBu website and then implemented in communities, schools, and all the rest. And so, our goal is to work with the United Nations. We're very involved in Europe. The Amulet Studio that created these characters is based in Zagreb, Croatia. We just presented actually last month. I was in Croatia and we presented at a sustainability conference where we introduced MaNaBu to the European Union, had immense response. It was great. And people want to help in big ways, small ways, all of the rest. And so as we develop the TV series, which is really ready now to take out the broadcasters, we are looking at these opportunities to create these movements, okay? Here's an example of one. Everybody's probably been to summer camp. In Europe, kids really don't go to summer camp. Some do, some don't, all the rest. Well, now imagine if kids went to camp and learned about sustainability. And so this is something that we're very interested in doing. And so what we want to do in Croatia actually is work with a local university to work with graduate teaching students. And the idea would be is that we would work with these graduate teaching students to implement, develop the curriculum, and then we would hire those graduate students to be the counselors at the camp. And then the idea would be that the kids would go and they would go to camp And then they would go back and they would learn and share all the things that they learned about sustainability, teach their parents, very important. And then these educators then would be able to bring these programs into schools. Now, this is a mural. And so I want to share a couple of things very quickly. And I think we have time, in a few minutes. So we came up with this idea of the mural. There was a recent grant that was implemented by the European Union. It was a Bauhaus grant. I'm sure all of you are probably familiar with the Bauhaus movement in the 1920s. And so we are implementing, we want to try to become a part of that. And so what we have developed is actually something along the lines of the Johnny Cash project. So I want to show you this really quick. Where is it? Where'd it go? One second. Okay, let me share. Oh, yeah, here we go. So the Johnny Cash project was very interesting. Johnny Cash, the actor, what happened was Johnny Cash collaborated. Hang on a second. Okay. Johnny Cash collaborated with an agency to create a user interface where people would come in and they would select a frame of Johnny Cash's last music video just before he died. And what they did is they had tools that they were able to animate that frame. And then those collective frames created by his fans became the mosaic, and in some ways a digital gravestone for Johnny Cash. I'm going to share this for a couple of seconds here so you can get a sense of what I'm talking about. This is from 2010. Okay, here we go.
There ain't no grave can hold my body down. There ain't no grave can hold my body down. When I hear that trumpet sound, I'm gonna rise right out of the ground. Ain't no grave can hold my body down. Well, look way down the river.
Okay, so, sorry, second. Okay, hi, I'm back. So, so that is a great, so this was something from 2010 where for the Johnny Cash project, the audience would contribute. So with this Bauhaus grant, we came up with the idea under the MaNaBu movement of creating a digital mural, an interactive mural that kids would become a part of. And so the idea for this came about from actually the Vivid Sydney Festival, which I attended in 2013. I'm going to share the screen again and show you that. If you have never seen it, it is pretty awesome. They project, Samsung sponsored this. They projected on the Sydney Opera House. Look at this for a second. Okie doke. So, that experience, you know, it's really important as a storyteller. You're always looking at the things around you. Here are two examples of something I experienced in 2010 and 2013. And in 2022, we want to have a digital mural around traveling the world that kids are creating. So what it would be is that kids would learn about some aspect of sustainability. We're in development right now. And then they'd go to this interface and they would color in a frame of the mural while learning a song about the issue that we're talking about. And then what would happen is that we would then, this mural would come together like the Johnny Cash project as a mosaic, and then kids would get to go see it. Now, I don't know if you've ever been familiar with directional speakers, but what we would do is the mural would be projected on the wall. So let's say the wall of, I can't think of a wall in Tempe, maybe the Frank Lloyd Wright Theater on the outside. And then what would happen is that a earth would be projected onto the ground in front of the mural. And using these directional speakers, when kids came together, and these are kids, you know, 3 to 12 as an example, when they stepped inside the earth, they would be able to hear the song. And so this would be the idea that kids are coming together to contribute to this piece of art to share around the world. And so that's what we were looking to do with that. Oh, hang on here. Okay. Okay, that is the end of that. So let me go back to this really quick. We are just about done. If you have any questions, please. Okay. Okay, so now the mural is the one. Now the next one here is earthquake kits. So I know you don't have earthquakes really in Arizona. Here in California, we have them all the time. And so when my kids would go to school, elementary school, they would create comfort kits that basically would be a Ziploc bag that would have a juice box and maybe a candy bar and a picture of their dog and a note from mom and dad saying everything's going to be okay and a little boo-boo Band-Aid if they need it. And this is something kids had. Well, interestingly, when I was in Croatia, I learned that they have earthquakes. They actually have a lot of earthquakes, just like California. And being ancient architecture in a lot of cases, they have major injuries. And so we had met a woman. She was actually the Japanese ambassador to Croatia. And, I was asking her, well, what do they do in Japan for kids to learn about, earthquake preparedness? And she said, well, they really just do one thing where it's, they have one day a year where kids have a disaster drill at school. And that's really it. So most people have this big earthquake kit on the right here. This is what they have in Japan. And it's a family thing, but they really don't have anything to comfort kids, because when you're having a disaster, kids get emotional and all the rest. And so we came up with the idea of creating a MaNaBu a comfort kit. And this would be for kids to learn about disaster preparedness, where this would be done in a school environment. We would have sponsored people that would help us create the elements. And then what would happen is that the kids would have this at school, and then they would go home and they'd keep this under their bed if something happened at home. And then they would teach their parents all the things that they learned about being prepared for earthquakes and how to use recyclable materials and all the rest. So this was one of the other movements. Again, it's really about empowering future leaders today, because they are really the ones that are going to implement change tomorrow. Now, there can always be programs and school activities and things like that, but as storytellers, as entertainment, you really, it's on us to really bring these new kinds of thought process, not just creating the content, but again, creating the community. Storytelling is all about points of engagement that teach us about our energy and our lives and all these different things that bring us together. This is the energy of storytelling, the language of storytelling. And wouldn't it be amazing if we could then do this and then use it to change the world? So this is the work that I have been doing with the Manabu Foundation. This is my email and my social accounts. Certainly anyone that's interested in getting in touch with me, I welcome collaborators of all shapes and sizes. So if you have any interest in collaborating in this space, please reach out to me. And the Manabu Foundation is a US entity that will be launching full force in early 2022. And it is, the website is MaNaBu. I'll make sure the web address is in the chat. So, okay. All right. Hello, Robert.
Hey, John, thank you so much for that really fantastic talk. It's very inspiring, actually, and I think our students will find it very, very inspiring as well, those watching and those who will be watching later, because they're not just going to be the ones who are being part of the participatory processes, but actually hopefully creating those collaborative world-building participatory processes that you're describing. So I like this concept of, empowering the future leaders. And I think at a meta level, you're empowering those who will empower future leaders by giving this inspirational talk. So thank you so much for that.
You're very welcome.
What do you think the future holds?
Well, I think it's a really interesting. Yeah, I think what's really interesting is that, again, governments, corporate entities, they are understanding. Most of the corporate entities have a major foundation element now. And these things, it's not the traditional foundations. These are, brands that are media centric. I've done a lot of work in Chicago, which is where I'm from, with foundations there. And, some foundations would rather buy a bag of rice than do a documentary.
Yeah,
that's right. A bag of rice is going to actually help somebody. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? As opposed to a documentary, who knows what's going to happen. So a lot of the work that I'm doing, a lot of the continued work that the Matabu Foundation is going to do is this idea of storytelling, social impact, technology, because, in places like Africa, mobile technology is big. Radio is big in Africa,
Right.
so things of that nature. So groups like what you're doing at ASU, the different labs and things like that, forward-thinking programs, these are the ones that are going to create these new brainstorming opportunities. And certainly, I hope you can consider me a resource to your program in the future. I'd be happy to support in any way.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, John, for that offering. I think we'll probably take you up on that at some of our various institutional labs and groups of, the students could learn so much from you, and we could learn so much from you in our organizational processes.
Thank you.
All right. Well, again, John, thank you for the talk, and thank you everyone who's tuning in from YouTube and from Zoom. So have a great rest of the evening.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.